There are some things that, deafness actually gives you that we consider to be deaf gain, things that you benefit from being deaf. Like with most cultural minorities, I think that people that are in the hegemonic majority have a lot of work to do educating themselves. It shouldn't be the burden of these communities to educate us. We should take it upon ourselves to seek out information and do better.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week on Speaking of Language,
Dr. Corrine Occhino joins us to follow up on her talk, What Everyone Should Know About American Sign Language and American Deaf Culture. We talk about language deprivation in deaf children, the phenomenon of deaf gain, and how hearing folks can help make a more inclusive world for their deaf community members.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager. We have Corrine Occhino with us today. Dr. Occhino is an assistant professor of languages, literatures, and linguistics at Syracuse University.
She gave a talk as part of our monthly LRC speaker series on what everybody should know about American Sign Language and American Deaf Culture.
You can watch her full talk on our YouTube channel, and we are excited to extend our conversation here today.
Welcome to Speaking of Language, Corrine.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. We had a great time at your talk, and we'd like to get into that a little bit more here on the podcast. But we like to start by asking about our guest's background and path with languages. So when and how did you start learning sign language?
Well, like many hearing people, I discovered ASL as a language that you can study in college. I actually had a friend, my father's friend, whose wife was deaf in my childhood. And so she would come to our house from time to time. But I think as a kid, I don't know if kids really know how to process those kind of things. Like I understood that she was using her hands, but she also kind of talked because we were all hearing. So I think that I didn't think much of it until later on when I kind of realized, oh, that's what that was, right? But I was already a linguistics student, declared for my undergrad, and I was thinking about going to grad school. And for grad school, we were supposed to kind of choose a language of focus, right? Something that we're going to write our papers on and kind of get into. And I kind of looked around at the different options. I was at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and we had a great linguistics program. And it just so happened that we also had a great ASL program. Unbeknownst to me, it was just kind of a happy accident. So I started taking ASL classes, and I just really fell in love with it. And as a graduate student, I just realized more and more how the training that I had received, which was 100% focused on analyzing spoken languages, didn't work in so many ways for ASL. And I just found myself really puzzled by that, right? Because linguists love to talk about this idea of human language, like language with a capital L. What does that mean? But I had only ever thought about language in the, auditory mode.
Sure.
So that really opened my mind a lot to what we mean when we talk about language and the human language capacity. And sign languages in general really challenge a lot of the ways that many linguists think about language.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that's interesting. So the film Coda just won Best Picture at the Oscars this year. Along with TV shows, commercials, and sports and news broadcasts, ASL is experiencing, as you called it, a pop culture moment. ASL is also one of the few languages nationally that has seen an increase in enrollments since 2016. As you pointed out in your talk, despite this growing popularity, the hearing world really knows little about ASL, its role in deaf culture, its status as a real human language, or the daily frustrations many deaf ASL signers experience as they fight for access and inclusion in the hearing world. So let's take these points one by one. What should everybody know about ASL?
Well, that's a really good question. I think the first thing is to recognize that ASL, or American Sign Language, is one of many sign languages, right? I think a lot
Mm.
of hearing people have this assumption either that sign language is universal,
Mm-hmm.
or that sign language should be universal, right? And so I think a lot of people have a misconception about that, whereas what we're talking about primarily in the American context is American Sign Language, which is unique from British Sign Language, which is unique from Japanese Sign Language. These are all completely different languages. So I think that's probably the most important thing to
Mm-hmm.
know.
So, what role does American Sign Language play in deaf culture?
So language, as you probably have talked with other guests, is often at the center of culture, right? So language connects people in a way that not only allows people to have a bond of solidarity by using the same language, but it's also a way to capture um, historical or cultural or artistic knowledge that's encapsulated within the knowledge of knowing that language. So I would say, in many ways, ASL is at the center of deaf culture and deaf identity. Um, and I think that's related to this idea of what does deaf culture even mean, right? I think that knowing a language is what unites many people within the deaf community rather than the concept of deafness on its own. So
Mm-hmm.
really, cultural deafness is about linguistic and cultural familiarity within a group more than it is about the way the hearing people think about it, which is a diagnosis of hearing loss.
You mentioned language with a capital L, right? And that people always think about auditory languages. Can you talk a little bit more about ASL's status as a real human language?
Sure. So ASL basically came on the scene in the mid 1800s when the first American School for the Deaf was founded in Hartford, Connecticut. And that school was the first place where deaf children could go and get a formal education. The people who helped set up that school actually were brought from France, from
Mm.
the French school for the deaf that was established well before that. And so deaf French educators brought French Sign Language to the United States as a tool for pedagogy and instruction. So these deaf kids from all over the Northeast went to this deaf school, and they brought with them various language experience. They might have had a home sign situation where they were the only deaf person in their family, and to communicate with their family, they
Mm-hmm.
would kind of make up signs in a very idiosyncratic way to communicate with primarily local family members. Or it could have been the exact opposite. They could have been coming from a place like Martha's Vineyard, which I'm sure the audience knows where Martha's Vineyard is. But what they might not
Mm-hmm.
know is that at one point in time, Martha's Vineyard was a center for deaf culture in the United States. And because there was a fairly high incidence of hereditary deafness, a sign language emerged in Martha's Vineyard that was used really throughout the island, the region there.
Yeah.
And so kids who came from those communities brought Martha's Vineyard sign language. And so this American Deaf School really became this, I guess, melting pot for language and kind of cultural emergence.
Yeah.
So ASL comes from that context, but more broadly, it's used throughout the US and English speaking parts of Canada. So it's a fairly broadly used language. It's also one of the most popular second languages in terms of people who are deaf that know a different sign language as their
Mm.
primary sign language, much in the same way that English is a very popular
Mm.
second language for people who speak other languages throughout the world. A little bit of a lingua franca, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
You brought up the Martha's Vineyard community during your talk, and I forget when or where I read about that, but that's a fascinating and an amazing thing to not know existed until whatever, my 30s, or it's just one of those
Yeah.
things that's not shared widely or taught widely, I feel. And it's so interesting.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think in a lot of ways, like many minoritized groups, their history and culture often isn't taught in more mainstream school programs. So most people don't know very much about deaf culture at all because it's not included in public school in the United States.
Well, and I do have to say, I've been thinking about this a lot actually since your talk. Growing up in Germany, the secondary educational system is very different in Germany than what it is here. And there have always been specialized schools for differently abled students. I can't tell you how old I was when I interacted with somebody who was not abled in the same way that I am, which blows my mind when you think about it, And I think you mentioned when you were on campus too, that oftentimes people only start thinking about people who communicate differently once they first encounter somebody who, can't speak, has difficulty hearing. And I think that's a big problem for education and for language classes. But it's sad how ignorant we are.
Yeah. And I think this kind of goes back to what you were asking about with the movie Coda and how important deaf representation is in pop culture or in media more generally, because it's that visibility that allows hearing people to think about what the challenges might be that deaf people face on a daily basis in terms of access, in terms of inclusion, in terms of just very basic things that we take for granted in a world that's structured for hearing, right?
Yes.
So I think when people see a movie like Coda, it's very eye-opening for them because they've maybe never thought about a deaf family with a hearing daughter, or they've maybe never thought about, what that might be like to be the only deaf people in a community and trying to be part of a community, what that looks like. So I totally agree with you. It's not ideal.
We were touching on this topic already. Are there other sort of daily frustrations that deaf ASL signers experience as they fight for access and inclusion in a hearing world?
I think there are a lot of different ways that access and inclusion impact deaf lives. One that I mentioned in my talk was this idea that it wasn't until just 2020, when the pandemic hit, that the National Association for the Deaf sued the US government to provide ASL interpreters for emergency broadcasts about this global pandemic. And the National Association of the Deaf won in district court. And so the court said that the government had to provide interpreters to give ASL access to the deaf community in this time of global crisis. And thankfully then, the Biden administration took that a step further, and they've been the first administration to hire a full-time set of American Sign Languages interpreters who are on staff at the White House for all of their press briefings. So I would say, that is one huge example very recently of trying to get access. But also even fighting for captioning. I mean, you would not believe how resistant to captioning hearing people are. And I don't understand this because as a hearing person, I use captioning all the time. Even before I was part of the deaf community, if I watch a show that's in a non-standard English dialect, from BBC maybe, sometimes I turn it on. Or sometimes if you're in a crowded, loud environment, and like at the airport or something, and you want to read the captions. But very often, when deaf people ask, we want to have what they call open captioning at the movie theater, right? So there's closed captioning and open captioning. And open captioning is just, the captioning is there. You don't have to turn it on. It's kind of part of the movie. But usually what happens is deaf people are given these really clunky, terrible glasses that they have to put on over their own glasses or whatever, where they can read the captions that are kind of superimposed then on the screen.
Oh, wow.
Because hearing people don't want to see captions on the movie that they're paying to see. So in Rochester, where I used to live, where there's a big deaf community, they have a lot of showings of open captioning where they'll like advertise and say, this Friday at 6:00, open captioning of Coda or whatever movie. But time and time again, I've seen deaf people try to say, like, could we just have like regular captioning all the time? And hearing people are really angry about providing captioning. I don't understand it at all. So you would think it's a very basic thing to provide, right? Like captions don't seem like a big ask, and yet it's huge. Or even for talks, right? Like when I give talks for an academic community, I make it really clear to the people that I'm giving the talk for that there has to be captioning, right? That before my video gets posted anywhere, it has to be captioned. But I would say, I don't know, conservative estimate, 75-80% of academic talks I see have no captioning.
Yeah.
So that means if you go online and you're a deaf person, you're trying to access information, even in your own field, there's no accessibility because people don't want to take the time to caption their own videos.
Yeah. Crazy. Yeah, we have a long ways to go.
Absolutely.
So you also spoke about ASL's roots in deaf education and about the fact that language deprivation is still a very real problem for deaf children in the U.S. Can you explain that a little more for our listeners?
Yes, absolutely. So the best way I think to explain the concept of language deprivation is to think about how typical acquisition works for hearing children, which is a child is born into a family, regardless of whatever language that family speaks. A hearing child is born to hearing parents. The minute they come out, those parents are talking to that baby, and that baby has full access to the sounds and the intonations and the phonemes that are coming out of their parents' mouths. And their brain automatically starts connecting the dots and finding patterns and learning language. But when a deaf child is born into that environment, by the virtue of the fact that they can't hear, if their parents are talking at them, right, not really to them, but at them, they're getting either a very degraded signal if they have residual hearing at all, or maybe no signal at all, other than kind of the visual mouth movements, right? But none of the things that we would really consider to be the core of, for example, English vocabulary or prosody or phonology or any of those things. The flip side of that is when a deaf baby is born into a deaf signing family, they have the exact same kind of experience that hearing children born to hearing parents have, which is the minute they come out and their parents are holding them, the parents are signing to them, and the child is being immersed in a visual language where they can start seeing patterns, seeing hand shapes, understanding prosody, all of these same things that we take for granted in typical language development.
Wow.
That can happen for deaf children who are lucky enough really to be born with deaf parents and have that immediate access to a full language. That's only conservatively probably less than 10%, maybe 8% of deaf children are born into deaf signing families, which means more than 90% of deaf children are born into hearing families who are usually woefully uninformed about deaf culture or sign languages. And more than that, I think that what happens is that there's a fear that sets in, right? There's a fear that comes from a hearing-centric view of the world that assumes that having a deaf child is a problem, is something to be worried about, is something to be sad about. And so what those parents are thinking many times is like, how do I make this child hear? How do I give them access to spoken language? But what we know is that, you know, cochlear implants or speech therapy, all of these things, they're great, but they don't substitute for full access to a language from birth, right? And so the kind of thing that generally starts to happen, because many of these deaf children with hearing families don't have full access to a language in those early parts of their years, is that we see what we call language deprivation. And language deprivation is the lack of access to a full language, right? And so they don't have the opportunity to build those connections and all of the things that go along with learning language, right? And it's very, very hard to catch up after that, right? If those children who are deaf, born to hearing families, ever get access to sign language at all, it often doesn't happen until school age when they enter a public school system, and then they can be provided with, interpreters, or maybe be in a mainstream classroom with other deaf kids. But at 5 years old, that's a really long gap between birth and 5 to have access to a full language. So language deprivation results from that kind of a circumstance, and it's still a real problem in the deaf community, mostly because of uninformed or ill-informed parents and honestly providers, right? Doctors, speech therapists, and people who also have a very hearing-centric view of deafness as a deficit rather than as something that is actually something to be celebrated as just part of regular, human diversity, right? The only thing that really is the problem is the fact that we've built a world that is not accessible. It's not really the not hearing itself.
Yeah. So you touched on this also when you were talking about language deprivation. What has research on ASL taught us about language and language learning?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've learned so many things about language acquisition and typically developing language trajectories. But also, there's something really special about looking at sign languages because they occur in the visual modality. So the visual modality has affordances, what we call affordances, that are not necessarily part of the spoken language modality. So one thing that we've seen in deaf children is that they learn very quickly, if they are exposed to sign language, where to look in order to get the best linguistic signal. So a colleague of mine at the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, Rain Bosworth, who herself is a deaf psychologist, has looked at infant eye gaze in deaf and hearing children. And what they find is that deaf children who really understand sign language, who, from birth, have very specific eye gaze patterns that emerge very early on as the children understand where to look to understand ASL. We also have seen, for example, that spatial rotation or understanding of three-dimensional space tends to be better in both deaf and hearing people who know a sign language. So there's some evidence that maybe even learning a sign language even later in life can increase your spatial and three-dimensional comprehension, your ability to rotate objects in space, just because you're using that system to access language, but coming with the language is really a strengthening of other abilities, right? So when you see signing, you have to be able to kind of flip what you see as, not thinking of it as the same way that you're seeing your hands. I don't know how to describe this, a lot of gesture, but right. So like if I'm signing, my right hand is on my right. If you're signing, your right hand is on my left.
Yeah.
And so I have to be able to flip that signal to understand, right, that my dominant and your dominant are actually in opposition to one another, rather than assuming that what's on my left is actually my left, right?
Got it.
So that's kind of part of the thing that you think of as being a general part of processing a visual language, but then that also aids in your ability to do that more generally, right? Your ability to take an object and rotate it 180 degrees or something like this.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So yet another reason for me to learn ASL, because I can't rotate anything in my mind. Spatially very challenged here.
Yes, this is right at the heart of deaf gain, as we talked about.
So learning ASL can be a first step for the hearing world to open the door to understanding deaf culture. What else can we do to help disrupt the hegemony of hearingness and make way for a more inclusive and equitable society?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's something that we as hearing people should really investigate, I think, and invest in. I think one of the best things that I can think of, and something that I tell my students, is to ask deaf people, right? I'm a hearing person, so I can tell you what I think is right, But at the end of the day, it's not me, right? It's not me who these things need to change for. So I think asking deaf people, what do you want? What makes your life better? How can we be more inclusive? And there are many ways, this whole concept of universal design that's become very kind of catchy in higher education, which is rooted in this idea of accessibility for all, right?
Yep.
Like making your materials, making your content, making your lessons available in more than one mode, have visual things, have, all kinds of ways to present information. And the idea with universal design is that it actually benefits everyone, right? Having more ways of accessing information is better for everyone. And different people benefit from different things. So the more you provide, the more access that you provide to people more generally. But so again, going back to this idea of captioning, even hearing students benefit from captioned videos, right? Especially when you're learning new words like hegemony, right? The first time I used this word in my classroom, my students were probably like, what is that word? But if I have it captioned and it's on a PowerPoint where they can see it and hear it, right?
Yeah.
Like they can link these two modes and it gives them one more thing to connect to try to start building that information. So captions is such a basic thing, but in addition to that, there's other simple things like, for example, think about going to a drive-up window. Think of how inaccessible that might be for a deaf person to go to a drive-up window,
Yeah.
right? And so what you've seen a lot of places going toward now is this idea of kind of touch screen ordering systems. Have you seen these? I've seen them at the airport at like McDonald's. We have it here at Dunkin' Donuts in our student union building, where you can kind of go up and you can just touch what you want, and then it shoots it to the person taking your order. And it's just like, it's such an easy thing, right? Rather than me having to go up or drive up and like speak my order. There's a million videos on YouTube of deaf people being discriminated against in drive-thrus where people either think that they're being pranked, right? That the person is trying to like drive up and do some kind of a prank, or that they're not willing to accommodate them. Like they try to take the order and then they say, we can't understand you, like whatever. And it's just a really sad, like simple, stupid thing that could be easily fixed, right? Another one is just more general knowledge of deaf and other disabled communities, right? Just thinking more about the natural diversity of the human experience and thinking about those things as not necessarily being a deficit, but as being something other, something, maybe better, who knows, right? So as we just talked about, there are some things that, deafness actually gives you that we consider to be deaf gain, things that you benefit from being deaf, enhanced, perceptual abilities or things like this. So I think that there's just a lot, like with most cultural minorities, I think that people that are in the hegemonic majority have a lot of work to do educating themselves, right? And it shouldn't be the burden of these communities to educate us. We should take it upon ourselves to seek out information and do better. But yeah, I mean, taking an ASL class is a great first step, right? Just trying to learn a little bit about the language and the culture that you would get in a first semester of a class. It changes a lot of students' lives. I mean, it's kind of one of those things like you don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah. Yeah, very cool. What other advice would you give to our listeners? That's a great start, but where can they start learning about deaf culture and ASL if they don't happen to know someone who is deaf?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I get this question a lot, and I also get this question a lot from people that are in my classes that maybe have kids or who want to learn ASL themselves, but they don't necessarily have the time to take a class, right? Like a formal class. There are actually a lot of great online resources for people who maybe don't have time to sign up for a formal class. There's one that's run through Gallaudet University, which is the one of the only two deaf universities or colleges in the United States. And it's called ASL Connect, and it's run through Gallaudet, and it basically is a free online interactive ASL lessons. where you can go and you can see basic vocabulary or introductory lessons for free. There's another one that I have a friend who is deaf, who is one of the people who started it, called Sign School. Sign School is another free reference. If you're using it in a classroom environment, there's a fee to sign up to use it for larger purposes. But for individuals, you just have to create a profile, and you can get started learning at your own pace. Basically, kind of like the idea of a Duolingo, right? But obviously based in the visual modality. Another great resource, actually, for parents who maybe have deaf children who would like to learn more about how to incorporate ASL into their lives, is a new resource that's run by also a colleague and friend of mine named Dr. Leah Gear, who is the program coordinator of the American Sign Language and Deaf Studies program at Cal State University, Sacramento. And she and her partner have started a new resource for parents with deaf kids that's called ASL at Home. And they have an Instagram page that you can follow, but it's basically family-centered ASL curriculum, right? Because the things that you might learn at a community college or at a college are more kind of like fun, conversational, things that you would learn as a second language learner, but they're not really targeted toward the kinds of things that parents who are interested in incorporating ASL into the lives of their deaf children might need.
That's great. And we will link to all these resources in our show notes. Before we sign off, we would like to ask you to share your favorite word in ASL. We'd like you to sign that word, and we'll share the video on social media and link it in our show notes. But we also would like you to explain what that word is. So, what is it?
Oh, that's such a great question. I have two signs that kind of come to mind. The first one, I guess you would probably gloss, which is the word for how we translate signs into English words, would be champ, CHAMP, champ. And the reason I like the sign champ is because it's kind of like on the left hand, this pointer finger, and then you put a crown on a person, kind of. So the right hand has this claw, 5-hand shape, and you put the crown on the person and you say champ, right? Champ. And really, champ means something's great or awesome. So you would see somebody being like, oh, that game yesterday, champ. It was so great. Or that lecture that I just saw about ASL and deaf culture, champ. It was so
that's
great.
what that was.
It was.
Right? Yeah.
It was very
champ. So I think that's a really cute one because it's like, ooh, champ. And then the other one that I really like and I think is pertinent to the conversation we've been having is what would be glossed as deaf bing, B-I-N-G or P-I-N-G, deaf bing, which means deaf tendencies, right? The ways of being deaf that are like, oh yes, that is a thing that deaf people do. So deaf bing, you sign the word deaf, and then bing, which is also the sign for tend or tendency, which is this is called the 8-hand shape, which is you have your middle finger extended and the rest of your fingers up, and you touch the center of your chest, and then you move it away in a away from your body fashion. So deaf, which is tap with your chin and your ear and your pointer finger, and then bing, deaf bing.
That's awesome.
Fantastic. Well, this was a treat. Thank you so much for speaking of language with us, Corrine.
It was wonderful to be here. Thank you so much.
Next week, we are excited to introduce a new LRC team member. Emma Britton is the new Learning Initiatives Coordinator here.
Tune in to hear more about Emma and the plans we have for supporting language students and faculty. Until then,
Auf Wiedersehen und auf Wiederhören.
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
or follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelica Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners. And do stay tuned for our next episode.